Okay, welcome to lesson 19. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about essay 3. So we have 4 objectives for this lesson. So first, I'm going to give you the assignment sheet for essay 3, and we're going to review that assignment sheet together. Second, I'm going to overview the structure of the essay and how you might develop essay 3. And then we're going to look at a sample analytical comparison written on the 2 articles on steroids and sports that you read before. So a nice sample at the end of this lesson. So after this lesson, I want you to read the 2 essays that are the basis for your essay 3. There are 2 essays on trigger warnings in colleges. And I want you to evaluate both those essays critically and then plan your essay and start writing essay 3. You should email me that essay when you finish the first draft, then I'll email you feedback, then email me the final, and you can move on to Unit 4, the last unit. And you'll be about 3/4 of the way done. So let's review real quickly. So in all the lessons in Unit 3 up to this point, we've been discussing how to think critically and how to use critical thinking to analyze arguments. In Lesson 16, I talked about Aristotle's 3 appeals of argument: the logical appeal, the emotional appeal, and the ethical appeal. So hopefully you have the idea of how to use those to evaluate your arguments critically. In Lesson 17, I used them to look at 2 sample essays, the 2 on steroids and sports. I looked at the Villa-Gomez and the Martin, and I evaluated both of those critically using Aristotle's 3 appeals, just so you can see how to analyze and evaluate an argument critically. Finally, in Lesson 18, I discussed logic in a bit more depth, and I had you evaluate for your journal 2 more articles on gay marriage. So hopefully that gave you a nice practice and have sharpened your critical thinking and analysis skills. Those skills are going to be, at a premium. They're going to be the basis for this essay, essay 3. So let's take a quick look at the assignment sheet for essay 3. You can find the essay 3 assignment sheet on MyCC under syllabus and major assignment sheets. I'll put it up there. But I'm going to just flip over to it right now and review it with you. Okay, so here's the assignment sheet for essay 3. I'm calling it an analytical comparison. And basically the point of it is to analyze 2 essays and then draw a conclusion based on your comparison of the 2. So your complete first draft should be about 3 to 5 pages, plus you should have a reference page for both of the sources that you use. And I want you to complete that as soon as possible and then email that to me like you did with the other essays at brooks.wengel@go.cambridgecollege.edu. So like I mentioned before, I'll give you some feedback on your essay, and then after my feedback, I want you to revise your essay and resubmit the final draft as soon as possible, and I'll grade that final draft out of 75 points. And as soon as you email me your final draft, you can move on to Unit 4 and start working on the last essay of the class. Okay, so let's start with a quick overview. So throughout Unit 3, we've been working on analyzing arguments and evaluating them in terms of their logical appeal, support with facts, statistics, and experts, emotional appeal, playing on the feelings of the reader, and ethical appeal, building credibility. Some of the better arguments that we've read, like the designer-player, have been relatively strong in all 3 areas, while some of the weaker arguments, like destroyed and gay marriage societal suicide, have had flawed logic, little evidence, low credibility, and wild emotional appeals. Hopefully our analysis of these articles has helped you to see the extent to which authors may try to influence you in how to effectively deduce a conclusion. Now here's the assignment. For this essay, which is an analytical comparison, I want you to do the same thing that you practiced in your Journal 5, which is evaluate 2 articles with different views on a common topic and then deduce a conclusion about which argument you think is stronger. The topic for this essay is a little bit unique. It's trigger warnings in college courses. So the idea of a trigger warning is that a professor warns his or her students of potentially traumatic material before assigning that material, so that the students can effectively prepare themselves to handle the material. So for instance, a professor who's going to show a film that has alcoholism in it might give a trigger warning to his class before watching the film, so he or she might say, trigger warning, this film contains graphic depictions of alcoholism or graphic sexual violence or something like that, so that students aren't caught off guard and have to, experience that trauma themselves. So the idea of trigger warnings is relatively new. It's been a really controversial topic in colleges lately because some people think these kinds of trigger warnings protect students and that they're really helpful for avoiding, repeat trauma or PTSD. But other people think that these kinds of trigger warnings hurt the open dialogue that colleges are supposed to encourage. So it's a really interesting discussion. And for this assignment, what I want you to do is to read 2 articles with different views on trigger warnings. The first is by Philip Wythe, and it's called Trigger Warnings Needed in Classroom. The second is by Harvey Silverglate, and it's called Liberals Are Killing the Liberal Arts. Both of these articles are handouts and available on MyCC under Syllabus and Important Assignments. After reading both, I want you to write a 3 to 5 page essay in which you summarize both of the articles and evaluate both of the articles critically, and then draw a conclusion about which author you think makes the stronger argument for or against trigger warnings, which isn't necessarily the same as which one you happen to agree with, just which one makes the stronger argument. So here's a little advice on the planning strategy for the essay. In order to be able to write this essay well, you want to make sure you spend some time analyzing the essays. Or spend a good amount of time analyzing the essays and planning your evaluation. So you want to start by reading both essays objectively. Make some annotations on both. Next, you want to figure out what's the claim or the thesis of which article, and summarize how each article makes its position. Next, you want to understand the argument, analyze it using some of the strategies we talked about. So you want to ask yourself, what's the logical appeal of the essay? How does it appeal to your logic or reason? And is it backed with evidence or experts? Are there any problems with the reasons or the evidence that the author presents? Next, consider the emotional appeal. Are there any places in the article where the author tries to appeal to your emotions and make you happy or sad? How? Is it effective? Is it not effective? Why? Finally, consider the author's overall ethos or the ethical appeal. Does the author establish credibility? Do you trust him or her? Why or why not? So after analyzing, so use these 3 to analyze, and after analyzing, you ask yourself, which argument do you think is the strongest and most likely to convince you to believe it? Not necessarily which one do you agree with. So that will help you to sort of plan how you're going to write the essay. So here's a few tips for the writing process of the essay. So once you spend some time thinking about and evaluating each essay, and you have a good idea for your conclusion, you want to start writing your essay. So you should definitely have an introduction that presents the topic in both articles that you're going to be comparing. After your intro, you want to probably think about handling one article at a time. So start by summarizing the first article, and then analyzing and evaluating that article. Then move into the second article, summarize the second article, and analyze and evaluate that article. Finally, you want to make sure that you write a conclusion, probably the most important part of the essay. That's where your thesis is going to be. Since this is a deductive essay, you'll deduce the conclusion at the end. And that's where you'll say which article is stronger and why. So this conclusion should follow both of your analyses and evaluations. That's one of the tricky parts of a deductive argument, is you want to make sure that your conclusion makes sense to the reader and that any reader would deduce the same logical conclusion. So finally, grading for the essay is going to be based on the structure of the essay. So how do you structure the essay? Do you have a nice introduction? Are your 2 summaries of the articles complete and accurate? Most importantly, your analysis. Do you analyze both articles? Do you look at the author's use of logic, emotion, and ethos or credibility? And do you give examples from the text of the logic and emotion and credibility? Finally, do you have a conclusion? And does your conclusion follow your analyses? And is it a strong thesis? Lastly, sort of grammar and formatting too. So once you finish that, just email it to me. Let's flip back and talk a little bit more about structuring the essay. So one of the best ways, I mentioned this in the assignment sheet, to structure this is by using the block comparison method. I think this is probably the best way to write comparisons in general. So in a block comparison method, you talk about one item completely and say everything that you want to say about that one item, and then move to the next item and talk about the second item completely and say everything you want to say about that second item. And in your conclusion, you state a clear thesis, and that's where you mention some of your points of comparison or contrast that allowed you to reach that conclusion. So here's a good sample structure for this essay. So you definitely want an introduction. Your introduction should talk about trigger warnings generally and what they are, and they should introduce the 2 articles. Then you should move into your first article. Let's say you're going to do Wythe first. Start by summarizing the Wythe article completely, and make sure you keep in mind those things we talked about with summarizing and quoting, author and title and main idea, and make sure your summary is complete and accurate but compressed. After you summarize the article, move into your analysis. And in your analysis, you want to look at the 3 appeals of argument. You want to make sure you look at the logos, or the logic, the pathos, or the emotion, and the ethos, the overall credibility of the author. That's a good guide for your analysis. Make sure that when you're talking about each of these, you're giving examples from the text. You say he has a strong claim, and you give an example of a claim. You say he has good support in this case, and you give some examples. Or you say the author's missing support when the author says this or this. Give examples of all of these 3. Ethos. You could say this author's credible because he has a background in this, this, or this, or this author's not credible because he doesn't have a background in this, this, or this. So deal with the first article completely, and then transition into the second article. And we're going to talk about transitions a little bit more in the next unit. So say, the next article that talks about, trigger warnings is the article by Silverglade. And start with a summary of the Silverglade article. Make sure it's complete, accurate, and compressed. And then move into your analysis. And in your analysis of Silverglade, use the same tools. Consider his logical appeal, his ethical appeal, and his emotional appeal. And then the conclusion is really the most important part of the essay. When you get to the conclusion, you want to think back over your analyses of these 2 essays, right? Look at what you wrote for the analysis of Article 1. Look at what you wrote for the analysis of Article 2. What were the strong points of this article? What were the weak points? What were the strong points of this article? What were the weak points of this? And then in your conclusion, state which article overall do you think is stronger and why. So that's a nice way to structure this essay, and that's the structure that we're going to look at in a sample. So I would suggest using this for your essay. Let's take a look at one sample. Here's a full-length sample by a student from a couple of semesters ago. It's a pretty good example, I think. Okay, so here's a sample of the essay, and this was written by a student a couple of semesters ago, and it was written in response to the 2 essays that we read before, the one by Villagomez, the designer player, and the other one by Martin, which was Destroyed. So this author has a very nice header over here, and he has a great title in the middle, Enriched or Destroyed Steroids. I like that. Then he has a good introduction, and then he moves into the first article, Villagomez, and he has a couple of paragraphs summary, and then he moves into an analysis, does a couple paragraphs on analysis, and then he transitions to Martin's article, Destroyed, and he has a few paragraph summary of that article. And then he moves into the analysis of Martin, and then he draws a nice conclusion, and after he has his references. So these 2 were in the book, so he has that reference there. You'll have all the material you need to create the references for the 2 that I put on the course portal. So let's take a look at this. The article starts here. In the last couple of decades, baseball has been involved in several scandals about players using steroids as supplemental to perform better. As a result of these scandals, baseball's fans debated about players who use steroids keep the sport of baseball alive and entertain, or instead they are ruining the integrity of the game. Rodrigo Villagomez, in his article, The Designer Player, gives his point of view about this matter. Villagomez claims that players as entertainers justify the use of steroids. On the other hand, Peter F. Martin, on his article Destroyed, argues that steroid-using athletes ruin the sport. So here's a pretty nice introduction. He has a few grammar errors in here, but he does have a good introduction to the topic, and he introduces both articles with the author and the title and the main idea of each. That's a good way to start your essay here. From there, he moves into the first essay. He says, Rodrigo Villagomez sees baseball as a multi-billion-dollar entertainment industry. In his article, Villagomez believes that the new generation of American sports does not see baseball as just America's pastime. Instead, he says, we must now see it as another business, struggling to produce a product that will be consumed by the common people. He makes a point that players are always under pressure to perform well and achieve the best results in each of their competitions. He claims that because of this pressure, players are more likely to consume any substance that helps them perform better. In this case, Villagomez says that the substance that professional baseball players consume is specifically steroids. Good. So here he's talking about Villagomez's main point, basically, which is that baseball is for entertainment, and that we should see baseball as entertainment, and steroids add to the entertainment. So next, the author moves into this paragraph. Then he gives his counter-argument. Remember, Villagomez had several paragraphs of counter-arguments. In his counter-argument, he says that many people believe that the drug affects players' integrity as well as the game itself. He advocates we should be thanking players for keeping the game popular. He also writes about the clinical definition of steroids. Villagomez emphasizes that steroids help players build muscle quicker. However, he says it does not make them better players. Players require training hard and keeping up with their exercise routine to be able to perform to the ideal conditions. Villagomez questions his opponents when he says that if it were possible to become a good player by simply using steroids, everyone would be using steroids. He also references the book by Jose Canseco, Juiced, which claims that players in baseball started steroids beginning as early as 1985. He writes about the integrity of the game. He states that baseball has not been a fair game for years. He supports this quote when he gives examples of other behaviors that players do in baseball. Villagomez also argues those opposed to using steroids that claim that steroids are a health risk factor. So here, he does mention all three of the counter-arguments that Villagomez raises. Remember, Villagomez talks about how some people have a problem with steroids because they help build muscle quicker, and he refutes that. And he says some people have a problem with steroids because they ruin the integrity of the game, and he refutes that. And some people have a problem with steroids because they think that they're a health risk, and he refutes that. So this author actually does mention all three of them and kind of some of what Villagomez says to refute. So I think that's pretty complete, although the organization could be a little better, but still complete. And then, nevertheless, he says that steroids are used in the treatment of breast cancer as well. Villagomez identifies himself as a fanatic of baseball. He ends his article writing that fans should be thanking players who use steroids because without those players, he claims that there might not be a game to watch. So this is pretty good. He mentions the ending here. I do think that this part, the steroids being used in breast cancer as well, kind of goes more with the health risk factor. He probably should have kept that connected to this paragraph. Also, this author doesn't give the examples. Remember, Villagomez goes into a lot of detail about the home runs and how baseball fields are getting bigger and how players love home runs. And he gives that great example of that time in baseball with Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa where everything was so exciting. So this author doesn't mention that. So I think he kind of misses that point. He doesn't mention the home runs or McGwire. But there are a lot of things in that essay. So he does miss a few, but I think he has pretty good summary here. Maybe he misses just a few of those points. So from here he moves into his analysis, and this is where I think this essay is particularly good. He says, Rodrigo Villagomez's background in sports supports his article. So he mentions his background. He served in the U.S. Army for 10 years in Afghanistan and Korea. Villagomez also worked as a sports broadcaster. Somewhere in his article, he also recognizes himself as a baseball fanatic. With this type of background, he made me believe that he knows the baseball game, body workouts, pressure, and results. He uses a good tone and good objectivity throughout his arguments. Overall, his ethos worked for me. My view of this author's credibility is good. So here he gives a nice conclusion about the author's credibility based on his background. He says he uses a good tone. He probably could have used a few examples here. What was his tone like? And objectivity, how do you know that he's objective? He could have gone into a little bit more detail there. But I think he is on track when he talks about the background and says that his overall ethos was pretty good. So next, this author moves into talking about the logo. So he says Villagomez writes and references different people and books in his entire article. So he mentioned some of the sources that he uses. For example, he mentioned Dempsey, Jose Canseco, and Ken Camentini. He also cited his resources at the end of the paper. Remember, he had a reference page. In fact, it supports his arguments. In most of his paraphrases, Villagomez starts with a counter-argument, they say, and different people's points of view about steroids. He addressed counter-arguments such as the integrity of sports, the speed at which players obtain results, and the health risks. Nice, that's pretty clear right there. And then he gives his point of view as well as other people in the industry. He even included an actual ex-baseball player in his article. He's very clear about the point he's trying to make. Villagomez uses good logic in the entire article. Overall, I like the way he addresses each of his counter-arguments. So here, this one's pretty good. I think he does a nice job discussing his logic. He sees the logic as good because Villagomez has a reference page and he mentions several different sources. He also sees the logic as pretty good because he addresses counter-arguments, fairly in his essay. So pretty good analysis there. And then he looks at the emotions in this little paragraph here. Villagomez is trying to evoke emotions at the end of his article. He identifies himself as a fanatic and suggests that fans should be thanking the players if they use steroids. In this part, he should be more conservative about his opinion. So this is one part that this author doesn't see as very strong. He thinks the emotions that he evokes at the end by identifying himself as a fanatic are a little over the top, and he wishes they weren't there, but overall it seems like he sees it as a pretty strong essay. And then he transitions to the next one. On the other hand, Peter F. Martin, in his article Destroyed, argues a much different position on the place of steroids in professional sports. He starts his article writing about the nasty chemicals that athletes use and how these drugs or nasty chemicals, and he quotes that, which is pretty nice, have made it into almost every professional sport. He claims that nowadays people could guess who's doping and who's clean. He gives an example about Sammy Sosa and how people would guess what type of juice he's taken. He claims that is the new sport. Then he moves into this one. Martin calls players who use steroids criminals, and he suggests that players, must be confronted and forced out. In one of his paragraphs, Martin questions what cheating is. He then provides some examples of cheating as injecting steroids in bats and being stuffed with cork. Furthermore, got the F here, Martin writes about purity on sports and references the original Olympians and how Zeus was no fan of artificial enhancers. Got that too. In addition, Martin has a strong argument about health risks. He provides an example of a player, Ken Caminiti, who died when he was 41 years old. Consequently, he connects Caminiti's death to the use of steroids. Martin also argues about the record of baseball. He says that many of the current records, for example, the most home runs in a season, should be marked with an asterisk because of the use of steroids. He concludes his article by saying that athletes who cheat are victims of far more serious maladies in their sports. So here I think he's really pretty complete in his summary. I think he captures everything in the essay. He talks in the previous paragraph about how Martin is against steroids in sports and calls the players sinners and references the nasty chemicals. And in this paragraph he talks about Martin's key pieces of evidence. He mentions the Olympians part, Zeus being no fan of artificial enhancers, and he mentions the part about the health consequences with Ken Caminiti. And he even mentions the very end where Martin references the asterisks and how the player's name should be marked with asterisks. So I think this is a pretty complete summary, pretty accurate, but also shorter than the original. So here he moves into an analysis, and he says, Peter F. Martin shows his background only in a small portion that is relative to sports. He wrote a sports column for the Daily News, but this is it. I do not think his experiences give him enough credibility to write about the baseball sport. Also, he did not use any references or did not have any facts about his arguments. In conclusion, his ethos is not ideal. So here he sort of realizes this author's ethos or credibility is not that strong because he only has sort of one example or one connection to sports. He's also a student. He didn't reference that in here, but pretty good analysis or pretty good critique of Martin's credibility in that spot. And here he moves into Martin's logic, and he says, Martin's logic about this topic is also not well set up, and that's a nice transition here. Almost immediately in his article, he uses very strong words against players that use steroids. He calls them victims and criminals. Also, Martin writes nasty chemical to reference steroids or other supplemental. I don't think that with this type of vocabulary, Martin has a good logical argument about steroids. He should provide some counter-arguments, they say, and then support his idea with his thesis. Instead, he was biased since the beginning of his article. So here he says he's going to talk about logic. He doesn't really mention the logic in this paragraph. He talks a little bit more about the emotional appeal, using the words like victims, criminals, and nasty chemicals. And he talks about the lack of objectivity. I think these are still kind of both more related to ethos. But he does have some good points in here about the author's objectivity not being very strong. In this paragraph, he actually moves on to talk a little bit about Martin's logic or logos. He says, furthermore, Martin writes in his article about Ken Caminiti and how he died very young. He's trying to claim that steroids killed him, But in reality, there's no facts that show this. He's making an ad hoc logical fallacy. Nice observation there, because he cannot prove the steroids caused Camuntini's death. I think that in this part of the article, Martin's trying to evoke emotions to his readers. Nevertheless, without evidence, it's too hard to convince the reader about his thesis in Camuntini's case. So this is a really nice observation of a problem with the author's logic. So his problem with the logos here, which is that you can't, he makes this post hoc, ad hoc logical fallacy in here. So pretty nice analysis. So we can clearly see that this author likes Villagomez's argument a lot more and sees it as a lot more objective and a lot stronger overall. So hopefully that's what he says in his conclusion. He says, in conclusion, I believe that Villagomez's article is much stronger, provides more credibility and better logic than Martin's article. And he has shown all of those things in here, so we have to agree with him. I'm not sure what to think about the use of steroids in sports, but one thing I learned from these two articles is that we should not judge the behaviors of players. We just don't know what their circumstances are. And so that's pretty nice. I like how he kind of moves into his own opinion. That's okay to do in the conclusion. You know, after you say which one you agree, which one you think is stronger, then you might move a little bit into which one do you agree with. Why do you agree or disagree with one of these points of views? So there's a pretty good example of the kind of essay that I'm looking for, the sort of structure and the kinds of analysis that I'm looking for and the way to do the conclusion. So use that as a sample, you know, when you're thinking about essay 3. So let's wrap it up here. So I want you to start writing essay 3, right? Download the two articles that are the basis for the essay 3 from ICC. They're the two articles that are on trigger warnings. The one's by Wythe and the other one's by Silverglate. I think you'll like both of those. I want you to read them carefully. As you read them, analyze them, think critically about them. What's strong about the articles, what's weak about the articles, and then design and write your essay. So make sure that you use the block structure as you're writing your essay. You know, handle one article and then move to the other article. And then once you finish this first draft, I want you to email it to me. It should be about 3 to 5 pages and have a reference page at the end. So email it to me at brooks.winchell@cambridgecollege.edu. So as with essay 1 and 2, I'll send you some feedback and then you should revise and resubmit. So once you email me your final draft, move on to the last unit and you'll be 3/4 of the way through the course and on to the final research paper. And I'll see you there.